Hey all, Josh here, and welcome to the first part of what will be an ongoing review series of the Gamera franchise. Shout Factory, in North America at least, is re-releasing the Gamera franchise on the DVD using the original high-def masters, new subtitle tracks, and lots of special features for these type of movies. So definitely look forward to those. If you're a fan of giant monster movies, kaiju fan, you definitely gotta check this shit out because they did a really good job. But this isn't a DVD review. I am actually gonna attempt to go through each of these movies and judge them objectively on their merit. So let's start off with the original, Gamera, the giant monster. Quite simply, this movie is really, really silly. And outside of introducing the Gamera monster, it is not really worth all that much critical attention, but, and there is always a but, that this movie is a crapload of fun. It starts off with Japanese investigators going to the Arctic to try and investigate a giant turtle, I guess. I mean, they already knew that there was a giant turtle somehow. At one point, Atlantis is mentioned, and no one even gives a shit. I mean, I guess I wouldn't give a shit either if there was a 160-foot-tall, fire-breathing, flying turtle running around as well because of it. But, wow. I mean, this is just an insane movie. I'm not even going to bother to try to summarize the plot because you've seen it so many times before. It's a giant monster movie. A giant monster comes out of the ice, or wherever the fuck they always come out of, and they start terrorizing Japan, always end up in Tokyo, of course. This is no different from any of those other movies. It's widely known that the Gamera franchise started as just a copycat of the Godzilla franchises, and this is actually a production from Daiei rather than Toho. A lot of people actually get that mixed up. So there is quite an obvious influence here, even really down to the whole kind of reptilian thing. But I have to stress that Gamera is an interesting creation in and of himself. He's a lot smaller than Godzilla. He doesn't nearly have the same destructive power, which is interesting because he has a lot more varied moves as well. If Godzilla is kind of a boxer with all those nice rules and one or two main attacks, Gamera is definitely a pit fighter, and with just lashing out with everything he can. And while that doesn't come into play as much in this movie as it does the next movie, which I also have a review in the can for, it is definitely still on display here because they get to showcase a lot of his cool powers. If you don't know who Gamera is, it is, as I said, a giant turtle who can go bipedal, though also goes quadrupedal, which I find interesting, and breathes and eats fire, and can fly using a flying saucer-like jet rotation. He spouts flames or jets out the side of his legs when he retracts into a shell, and like I said, spins like a flying saucer. One thing I do find interesting about this movie is that it's set with the backdrop of the Cold War, rather than kind of the 1950s idyllic society. It's interesting to see that, because you really don't get to as often. Also, there's some really cool things in this movie, particularly a use of effects. At one point in the movie, Gamera smacks down one of the miniature buildings and knocks the top half off, but in doing so, he knocks off and reveals all of the people inside it. And you see them during the miniature attack, where there's a lot of nice long shots, by the way. And you see them running away, and then he breathes the fire. Clearly there's no humans in that shot, because it's just a small doll or a guy in a suit. And you see the humans then cower, and then the screen flashes white to show they're being burned. And I think that's a neat way of getting around the violence. It's an interesting way to do it, if nothing else. There's a lot of creativity going on here, particularly, like I said, even in the design of Gamera itself. But the final plan to defeat Gamera, I'm not going to spoil it, because it is the most outrageous thing imaginable, that every second you think about it, you think about it, it just gets more and more improbable and silly, and is quite possibly one of the silliest climaxes I've ever seen. But nonetheless, like I said, this movie is a lot of fun. There's really no point in discussing the characters. They're almost copy-paste from Gojira, where you'll have, the scientist that's not necessarily as mad in this one, but helpful, actually, quite. You have the main male character, main female lead. The one thing you do get much earlier in this franchise than you do than the Godzilla franchise, before it kind of became more kiddie fare, is a Kenny. And if you don't know what a Kenny is, it's basically a small child in short shorts, as it were, who goes around sympathizing with the monsters. And definitely have it in this one is quite possibly the most annoying Kenny I've ever seen. And that's really saying something, because I've seen Godzilla's Revenge. Like, Jesus, this kid is inadvertently hilarious, though. I mean, he really just throws himself at Gamera like, I love you, Gamera! And then comes on a train. as it's going towards it, and Gamera's eating it like spaghetti, and the train blows up, and he's still okay. I don't know how the fuck that works, but he's still okay, and he's still cool with Gamera. I just don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense, but you know what? None of it really makes a whole lot of sense in this movie. They do try and explain it somewhat, but it's all silliness. One thing I do gotta mention is, too, when Gamera's first seen in the Arctic, one of the boat captains literally goes, "SOS, gigantic turtle spotted." I can't even imagine what the person on the other side of the line must have been thinking at that. I don't know how you could keep a straight face and say that line. Wow. Also interesting, though, is that this production is rather international, much more so than the original Gojira, or at least the non-King of the Monsters one where they inserted Raymond Burr. It actually has quite a few English-speaking actors. There's actually not even that much Japanese in the first third of that movie, because there is United Nations workers at one point, maybe some English as well on part of the Arctic, or the Inuits, I guess, Eskimos. They actually call them Eskimos in that one. I find that kind of funny, too. And, as well, because the American forces actually take a lot of part in this. It's kind of interesting to see this whole world conflict, especially in light of what I said, that the Cold War backdrop, because it suggests it's more a peaceful solution, actually, rather than Gojira's kind of very harshly condemning tone. Blessing, I say. And it's interesting. It's definitely lighter fare. This really is no huge message to it, don't get me wrong, but it's interesting to note nonetheless. I really find that watching these movies is both a history lesson as well as just a whole lot of fun, because I mean you come to see the monster blow shit up, but you stay because of all the little neat things you see. And I've seen a lot more than that, don't get me wrong, but there's really not much I want to cover because this review is already running a little long, and I don't want to over-speculate on the intentions of the creator of this movie, but the title sequence was very well done. The actual doll, or the actual suit for Gamera, hit or miss. At times, you could see the flame, like the flame thrower, I want to say, but that's not the right word, inside its mouth, and that really kind of took you out of it, particularly the infamous, jet planes hung up by strings is in here as well. But overall, the miniature work isn't terrible. Like I said, there's some interesting bits, and one thing I do want to note before I get out of this, though, is while the soundtrack is kind of jazzy, too, that's pretty interesting, forgot to mention that, is that there's a lot of really interesting shot composition to this movie, whereas Gojira and majority of the Godzilla movies, I guess most of the early ones at least, focus on very enlarged shots, or extreme close-ups of the human's perspective as Godzilla's enormous foot just smushes them, and that's really cool, don't get me wrong. But the Gamera franchise, even with Gamera's smaller height, smaller size, it has a tendency to do a lot of long shots, which is really interesting. It puts Gamera's destruction in perspective and gives him kind of an ominous, kind of not far off feeling, but gives him an ominous sense of impending doom rather than doom is here. And I thought that really added to it. Particularly, there's one scene where Gamera is in the rain, too, where they changed the eyes of the suit, and it looks really, really imposing, really fantastic. Overall, this movie is just a bucket of laughs. There really is not much serious here, but I have never laughed so hard in my entire life. I can totally understand why Mystery Science Theater 3000 did this, because it is stupid beyond belief. But if you like giant monster movies, you gotta check it out. And I totally recommend the Shout Factory DVD, by the way. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check it out, Google it. It's got a lot of things on there, some interesting things, a commentary track that's really, really nice. And, yeah, Gamera the Giant Monster. A good start to what looks like to be a very fun franchise. Stay tuned for my review of Gamera vs. Barugon, the sequel.